Welcome, everybody, to SAIS. We have a very interesting conversation ahead of us about the Argentine elections. It's been quite a ride this year for Argentina. I'm sure all of those who watch what's going on in the country are quite eager to learn the views of our very distinguished panel. With me, I have Paula Alonso from Washington University, Paula, Professor Benjamin Gedan, and Professor Monica de Bolle. Welcome. Great to have you here. I'm very much looking forward for this conversation. So the way this is going to work, I'm just going to do some very brief introduction. Then our panel is going to give you remarks about the situation in Argentina, and then we're going to have a small conversation with questions, and then I'll open to the floor. So as all of you know, Argentina has a new president-elect, Alberto Fernández from Frente de Todos. President Mauricio Macri managed to perform quite well in the general election, despite having lost massively in the primary, but almost like 17 points. So Cambiemos, after 4 years, is going to hand over the presidency to the Peronistas, and with a very diverse and heterogeneous coalition with Kirchnerismo, Peronismo Federal, and Sergio Massa from El Frente Renovador. Just one quick view, I think the entire region is going through some very tumultuous times, so I think it is going to be quite a ride for Argentina going forward with many economic and political challenges. So Paula, I would like to start with you. I was hoping you could give us a little bit of an overview,
all right,
historic overview of how do you see this particular time for Argentina?
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for being here today. I'm a historian, so I like to, see things in the long term. And as a historian, I would like to just start by placing this election in a long historical context. So we have 103 years of history of democracy in Argentina. So we generally count in 1916 our first democratic presidential election, even though women won't vote until the middle of the century, but that's generally how it's been seen. And in those 103 years, this will be the third non-Peronist, democratically elected president that will finish his term in office. Okay? And so, of course, it's the first one, and will be the first one on December 10th to finish since the start of democracy in 1983. So this is something to bear in mind. Our record of democracy in the 20th century was really poor. And so this is, for many reasons, a very special moment in the country's history. It is also important because this consolidation of democracy that we're seeing with this return of the events, a non-Peronist finishing his term in office, is sort of points to a sign to the consolidation of our democracy. In times in which we will look at the world context, democracy is in crisis, or at least there are big question marks across the board about the value and the practice of democracy. So Argentina generally goes against the different rhythms in the world, and here is one. We are consolidating while the rest of the world is sort of questioning it. The other interesting thing to bear in mind is that we are consolidating democracy in a moment in which we haven't really yet consolidated a very historically stable economic policy. So as you know, in the 20th century and even until now, Argentina has been going through crisis to crisis. We haven't grown, and we haven't found a solution to this. We haven't been able to found long-term economic policies that will provide inclusive growth to the country. And so the fact that we are consolidating democracy while we still go from crisis to crisis is actually something also to bear in mind. I think is particularly relevant. And also related to that, we resolve and we go through these economic crises and also institutional crises too, like 2001, but we have been resolving them through democracy. So again, these economic crises, which have been huge since 1983, we found ways of going through them without really breaking down the democratic system, at least not too much. We twisted a few things, but we haven't, the system has not broken down. unlike other countries in the region, and more recently the case of Bolivia, our democratic process is transparent and fair. It does provide legitimacy to those who are elected in power, and it has been doing so since 1983. So again, this is something that we compare to our own history and also to the region is something to underline. And I think in the first 2 days that we have of transition, that have been actually quite two good days. Again, given the history already mentioned, we don't really have good experiences with transitions, particularly between going from different parties, from one country to the other. We have to remember Alfonsina Menem. Alfonsina had to leave 6 months before. We also had to remember the 2001 crisis with the La Rúa Alliance, and also the Cristina to Macri transition was less than ideal. So in comparison to those, these last two days we are about to finish actually look quite promising. I mean, much more promising than we had anticipated, particularly when we look at the last weeks of the campaign, where the language became quite aggressive between the candidates. It seems that they turned the page and they're moving forward. And that is really great news. We are not used to this. We never had a transition team that's been announced and launched and so forth. So this is actually very new and quite amazing when you think about that. So I think what we have been developing, therefore, particularly we remember the 2001 crisis, is that we have been developing a democratic culture in the country that seems to be quite strong. And democratic culture is actually quite relevant because democracy, the mood for democracy can be flicky. People's moods about the democratic processes change. And even within the same institutions, without changing them, when that mood changes, the practice of democracy changes. The language becomes more aggressive. We don't recognize the legitimacy of the opposition. So even without significant, and we can see this, nowadays in many areas of the world. So the fact that here we have been developing gradually, and maybe even without noticing, a good democratic culture, again, is something to bear in mind. Of course, there have been tensions during Macri's presidency. We have to remember the violence in front of the Congress in December 2017. The many piquetes and mobilizations that were going on in the streets, the references to the helicopter in some of these demonstrations, making reference that he might not finish his term in office. But all that, we just lived through it. And so the culture of democracy seems to have been developing quite strongly. So good news in many ways. Still a very long to-do list to improve our institutions. We are not, of course, we are not done. One area that we need to look into is the subnational level. There are only 2 provinces in the country, Mendoza and Santa Fe, that they don't allow for consecutive re-elections of the governor. In the rest of the provinces, we have been seeing in the last years a complete repeat of the same governors, the same parties in power, and so forth. So again, the democratic culture seems not to be that strong at some national level. So we might need to pay attention to that. The judiciary system is going to be tested in the next 4 years, particularly because of the corruption issues that affect also the vice presidential elected candidate, Cristina. And so today they have been used in both directions on that respect, but it is going to be quite tested. The Supreme Court has very low population rates in terms of public opinion. People don't like them. They have been losing respect. And again, this judiciary system as a whole has been very much challenged in the last few years, and it will continue to be so in the next few years. Shall I carry on, or should I just? I can say something now about the election itself.
Yeah, I was hoping you could comment on the results, because one of the debates that sparked in Argentina after the election was that bipartisanship was kind of like rebirth. With Cambiemos reaching like 41% and Peronistas reaching 45%. We also similar results from the one we saw in 1989, for instance, and also in 1994. What do you think about that?
Right. Okay. So Yeah, what we've been hearing recently is many analysts saying, oh, we're going back to our two-party system that we lost in 2001 in particular. So since 1946, Argentina, as you probably know, has been divided between Peronists and anti-Peronists. And the anti-Peronist front generally was, encapsulated by the Radical Party. And then after the 2001 crisis, which was a crisis of legitimacy as well, institutional crisis as well as economic crisis, that sort of non-Peronist pole sort of was dilapidated. So in 2001, I don't know if you remember, we had this huge economic crisis and also this political crisis by which the slogan was, que se vayan todos. We want them all out. So the civilians did not want any more politicians in government. Something in a way similar without the economic crisis that Chile is experiencing today. The crisis that people did not feel represented by the politicians in power, but none of them. But from that crisis in 2001, the Peronist Party recovered much more quickly than the opposition. And so that Radical Party sort of more or less, did not disappear completely, but it became greatly diminished. And the opposition the non-Peronist opposition had difficulty in reconstructing that pole. And so what analysts have been saying now is that the rise of Cambiemos that brings together the anti-Peronist and non-Peronist pole, which is also in alliance with the Radical Party, let's remember that, is the way in which that opposition to Peronism now has been channeled. And they are sort of, given again the results, it seems that they will continue as an important opposition to the Peronists. That's one way of looking at it. And the reason why people say that has to do with not only the results that produce this sort of more, even equilibrium between government and opposition, of Peronists and non-Peronists, but also because of the kind of electoral results in which the Peronists went back to having the support from their old base, and the old base has always been the working class. The Peronist is a multi-class party, but the main support comes from the lower classes, and historically used to be the trade unions, and now are more sort of people who depend from the state, more clientelistic policies and so forth, and less educated and more poor regions. So when we look in terms of class and in terms of geography, again, Cambiemos, whatever it's called, let's call it Cambiemos because Juntos por el Cambio is quite, a mouthful. But Cambiemos sort of, again, won in regions like, which have been the richer parts of the country, Mendoza, Córdoba, areas of Buenos Aires, which are the richer ones, wealthier ones, Entre Rios, Santa Fe. And so people say, oh, well, we're back to the old days, Peronist and non-Peronist, working class with some alliances, and regionally we're back to how things used to be. Of course, that will depend on what happened in those two coalitions. So we have these two poles, but each pole will have to resolve who the leaders are in each pole. And so in the Cambiemos poll, we have many options. Macri already calling himself the leader of the opposition. But we have Ruiz Larreta, we have Vidal, we have the radicals, Cornejo and others who want to have their say, that they feel that have not been very well treated in the past in this alliance. And now that you might have the chance, particularly because the radicals are the ones who have more control in the provincial areas that supported Macri. And then, of course, we have the poll of the Fernandez, in which Fernandez will be the one that leads. So some analysts say, well, they have to resolve these leadership issues. They already have the voting patterns, and now we can go back to a bipartisan system. There are, however, another scenario that can happen. I mean, that could happen, and it depends on what happens in each group, in each coalition. But it's another scenario that could also happen, which is that if we go back in history, not as long as 1916, but as long as the 2001 crisis. And so we see a voting population in Argentina that has like 1/3 or a little bit more than 1/3 that is really loyal to the Peronists. It doesn't really matter what happens with the country, with the economy, et cetera, they're going to always vote for the Peronists. And we have 1/3 or a little bit more that always votes anti-Peronist or non-Peronist. And then we have the rest that, depending on what happens, it will just move to one pole or the other. So if we look at the demands of the population in the last 20 years, since 2001, that crisis was a crisis que se vayan todos, but also was a crisis for demand for the end of corruption, transparency, good institutions. Those were the slogans that the Alliance in 1999 won the elections by 48% of the votes. And that has been a demand that has remained constant in the population in Argentina in large sectors, I would say more than 1/3 of the population. And it was a demand that it was answered by Cambiemos too. That was the campaign in 2015. But it's also a demand that you could find in sectors of the Peronist party. So when Alberto Fernandez used to criticize Cristina, the reasons for the criticism, or one of the many, were corruption. Today, in the transition team, we have Dilma Ibarra, who was a huge critic of Cristina and wrote a book, Cristina versus Cristina, talking about how she was corrupt and authoritarian and so forth. So those demands are not just in the Cambiemos sector. Some of those demands can be satisfied by sectors of the Peronist party. And so if Cristina pushes too hard on Alberto has options. He can go to the governors, which of course he's doing, but he can also go across the aisle and get support from the Cambiemos sector. The Cambiemos sector, who is also going to continue to support ideas of against corruption and so forth. If that happens, then those two big coalitions might get a little bit blurred. And let's remember that Nestor Kirchner was somebody who liked that, who liked sort of those more sort of coalition building across the aisle kind of policy. And so Alberto could follow that. And a good, let us say I want to say before I give the space to my other speakers, but yeah, I don't think he had a chance to see the festivities of Sunday night on the Peronist front when they won. And people have commented on many aspects of those, the fact that, Cristi Love, the new governor to be of the province of Buenos Aires, captured a lot of the attention with a long and loud speech. Cristina too, the governors were not there. So people have commented a lot about, well, what can we read from that? But one thing that stuck to me for that moment was something that has not been mentioned that much, which is that one of the things Cristina did was that she turned around to the Peronists behind her and she said, and we are going to continue united. So she's really scared of the Peronists to disintegrate. So for her, the main option is for the Peronists to remain united, because within that united Peronism, she has 30% of power. She has tremendous amount of power. So she's fearful of Sergio Massa leaving again. She's fearful of, she doesn't trust Alberto, and they don't trust each other, what he might do. Today, the picture of Alberto Fernandez with the governors in Tucumán was also quite telling. But Alberto can also go and speak with the people from Cambiemos too. And so therefore, the bipartisanism might not be as clear. So we have to wait and see what happens with the leaderships.
Yeah, a very fluid situation.
It could be. Yeah, it could be.
Benjamin, let's go with you. You've been quite a privileged witness of the last political changes in Argentina. You worked with the Obama administration, and you worked firsthand, the handover from Cristina to Macri. You direct a project focused on Argentina at the Wilson Center for the last 4 years, and now you get to see from that position, a new change. How do you see the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Argentina going forward, which is kind of vital, especially for the economy?
Sure, and thanks so much for organizing this, Monica, and thanks. I see some of my students are here. I see some of them are not.
Benjamin is the name. All right.
No, I think it's an important question. I mean, it gets to the issue of why care about all this Argentine internal politics between Peronists and non-Peronists. That can seem mostly of interest to only Argentines and relevant only to the country. But Argentina has been this idea that kind of going against the grain or on the leading edge of some regional changes, and in relation to the United States, is a significant actor. And so in the so-called pink tide period, for example, Argentina was among the more radical players in the region, seeking actively to balance US interests in Latin America, to bring in new partners and new players such as China. It had a closer relationship with Iran and Russia during the Cristina years. And then when Mauricio Macri won the election in late 2015, it was seen as the beginning of the end of that period of left and center-left rule in Latin America, and the beginning, what people thought at the time, might be a longer period of governance from the center. You then had conservatives governing in Chile and in Brazil again, and for the first time in a long time in Colombia. And so these regional trends, although again, one must be cautious not to try to paint the whole region as experiencing any particular economic or political phenomenon at the exact same time. I think there is something to these trends, and so there is a significance to Argentina moving toward the left. And again, in the Fernandez versus Fernandez context, we don't know in foreign policy either just how far to the left Argentina will go. But let's just say that certainly the policies will change both toward the United States and toward the region. And so maybe I'll just speak for a minute about what that might mean, and we'll including for the bilateral relationship. So again, Argentina, in its more, looking at its more recent kind of foreign policy orientation when governed by the Peronists, was very explicitly attempting to bring a project of Latin America without the US as this major dominant actor. It was a classic kind of rhetoric of anti-imperialism, of empowering multilateral institutions that excluded the United States. So the Organization of American States as the historic institution for coordination in the region became less central, and institutions such as UNASUR became much more predominant. There was an institution in CELAC that was formed as well. A lot of this is sort of attributed in hindsight to Venezuela in its heyday, having a lot of influence and resources to push around, but Argentina was very much a partner in all of these efforts. When Argentina famously under Nestor Kirchner hosted the Summit of the Americas in Mar del Plata, there was a counter summit that Nestor Kirchner presided over, and then he attended this counter summit that Hugo Chavez, was organizing, even though he was the host of the actual summit itself. I say that because, again, we don't know exactly how much influence Cristina Kirchner will have in this government, but the idea that Nestor Kirchner was governing as a much more pragmatic, sort of moderate figure, and so Alberto Fernandez, the president-elect, who was the chief of staff, could be assumed to govern also in the same manner. I think it's important to remember that Nestor Kirchner was very much the beginning of this shift in Argentine foreign policy. Again, it became much more radicalized under Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, but already that movement within Peronism had a very different worldview than certainly you found under Mauricio Macri.
So you're not buying the narrative that Alberto Fernandez is going to be a moderate president?
I think so. It's possible, right? I mean, I think the arguments in favor of that are that he's conditioned by various domestic and international factors. I'll list them briefly. I think there are compelling details. That the region, as I pointed out, does not look like it looked in the era when Venezuela had a lot of resources, when again, Brazil, when Chile were allies of Argentina, when China was growing, when externally the Argentine commodities were providing a lot of revenue, and Argentina was very much recovering economically in the early Nestor period and throughout it, and in the first term of Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, when the Argentines were not dependent upon the IMF in the way they are now. So there is this idea that I think is a bit optimistic, that Argentina has no choice now but to be much more pragmatic and moderate in its relationship with the United States and other actors. We certainly didn't see that in the night of the election, right? There was this happy birthday message to Lula from the president-elect. There was the free Lula symbol. So there's already a conflict with Brazil.
For those who don't know.
Main trading partner.
There was also an implicit recognition to Evo Morales.
There was a recognition of Evo Morales, a disputed election that the United States and most other countries haven't yet recognized. So it was a rather radical start, and to me, completely unnecessary to delve into the most controversial aspects of Argentine leftist foreign policy on the night of the election. With the United States, the signals have been more reasonable, but I think there, and we can talk about it in a bit, there's going to be areas of policy disagreement, Venezuela above all, that I think will create conflicts with the Trump administration, even if on all other issues, Alberto Fernandez turns out to be as moderate as some people think he will.
All right. Monica, let's go. Benjamin was talking about restrictions as sort of like a wall to moderate the following government. Obviously, everybody's thinking about the IMF. You work for the IMF. How do you see that very complicated and complex relationship going forward? Of course, let's just remind that Argentina is now the largest creditor of the IMF. Yeah. There's a program that's now in limbo, and they should do something quickly about that soon, of $57 billion, 44 already dispersed to Macri. So how do you see that going forward?
So first, let me welcome all of you, and thank you for coming, and also our distinguished panelists, all of them, for accepting the invitation to talk. We've been doing these events. We did them last year with the Brazilian elections as well, where we wanted to sort of have the first reaction right after a major election. So I'm very happy that we got to do it this time. I'm very unhappy to have to answer a question about the IMF, but I knew that that would fall to me. So I will do my best to give you my thoughts as to where this very complicated relationship stands. So as you all know, Argentina has quite the history with the IMF. It goes back a long time. It was one of the countries when the fund did, because the fund does on occasion internal reviews of its own policies. And Argentina was one of the countries that back in the 90s, when the fund was looking at its long-term involvement with countries, meaning, the countries where it had started an adjustment program with and lent money to, and then it kept on re-lending money to the same country in order to actually finance itself because the country was not really implementing the reforms that they were supposed to implement. The two countries that the fund did that the most for, I think in the world, but certainly in Latin America, were Argentina and Brazil. So the history's long. The history is not happy at all. And the fund in Argentina had remained, after the default in 2001, you know how there was a huge standoff between the fund and Argentina and massive disengagement. And back in 2018, around sort of the early summer of 2018, actually May, so the late spring of 2018, when emerging markets as a whole came under stress because of fears over what was going to happen to U.S. monetary policy and a host of other factors, Argentina came sort of into the spotlight of the countries that were most vulnerable. And this kind of harks back to something that Paula said earlier. So Paula was speaking of, the history of democracy in Argentina and of politics, and she mentioned the economics and how Argentina has been so unstable. Actually, when you look at the economic history of Argentina since 1975, and if you go by metrics like GDP and inflation and the number of financial crises that Argentina has had, Argentina has really only had 2 periods of relative macroeconomic stability since 1975, okay? And those 2 periods are the first 4 years of roughly the first 4 years of the convertibility plan. So that's from 1991 to roughly 1995, when, by the way, Argentina had a banking crisis. And the second period is the period that Nestor Kirchner was in power. So the period between 2003 and roughly 2007, right before the financial crisis. So that's 8 years when you count them, in a very long period of time. 8 years, far apart, of 4 and 4 of relative macroeconomic stability. So that says something about, the underlying economic problems, economic institutions, and issues that Argentina has not been able to deal with, and that the fund hasn't helped with either. So coming to the present, when Argentina called on the fund in June of 2018, after the emerging market turbulence of May, it was pretty clear at that point, even though markets had been extremely optimistic with respect to Argentina, shortly before, I mean in 2017, so not too long before the turbulence hit in May of 2018, Argentina had launched the famous 100-year bond, which people actually bought. Many did.
Very successful.
Yeah, so that 100-year bond, by the way, is now trading at, I think, something like 20 cents to the dollar. So it's lost 80% of its value since 2017. But so when you look at the underlying problems that Argentina had and the massive imbalances that Macri inherited from the previous administration, it just seemed absolutely unlikely from anyone who was standing on the outside to look at this and say there's actually a way out. So when the fund actually came to the table and afterwards announced, this first 50, right?
50, yeah.
$50 billion plan with a $50 billion program, which was later augmented to $57 billion. I can say pretty much that a lot of people were in shock. First of all, they were in shock to see the fund coming to Argentina's rescue with this massive package. This is the largest program that the fund has ever given to a single country. Secondly, everybody was in shock because a lot of that money was actually the way by which the program was organized, was set up. A lot of that money was going to be in fund speak. Sorry, I have to use fund speak now. A lot of that program was going to be front-loaded. In fund speak, that basically means a lot of the money was going to be given earlier as opposed to later. And that's not typical of the fund. Usually when the fund goes into a situation that is as complicated as Argentina's was, where so many reforms need to be done, and where these reforms are politically complicated, the way by which the fund actually disperses the money has a kind of an incentive compatibility aspect to it. So, it's kind of like a carrot and a stick. So it tries to, set the disbursement schedule so that it ensures that at least some of the reforms are going to get done. Obviously, if you front load a large amount of the program, that basically takes the pressure off from authorities, and therefore the chances that reforms actually get done diminish. And this time around, the fund did something completely different. When we look at why or we try to understand why the fund did things differently this time for Argentina, there are basically two explanations. The first is that it was coming back to the region after being gone for such a long time, and it was re-engaging with Argentina, a country with which it had had very bad history in the past. So in a sense, it was trying to wipe the slate clean and say, here we are, we're here to help you. Let's forget the history, let's forget the past, and let's try to work on a different sort of path going forward. The other aspect that was important is that this was a non-Peronist administration. It was an administration where the economic team in particular had a number of members who had been former IMF staff. And so the IMF had this comfort zone where it could actually speak to these members of the economic team with the same language that it was used to speaking internally, because these were people who had previously, a lot of them had previously worked at the fund. So in all of this, there was obviously a political calculation on the part of the fund and on the part of the fund's leadership, namely Ms. Lagarde, who is no longer there, that politically this was going to be very good for the fund, and politically this was going to be very good for the fund in the region. But of course, the whole premise of the program was based on everything turning out right, and having everything turn out right and fall into place, we all know that the probability of that is rather low. The probability of that in a country with the history of Argentina, where you'd only had 8 years of macroeconomic stability far apart in time, that probability is even lower. So it was a huge gamble on the part of the fund, and it was a gamble that now places the fund in as difficult a situation as Argentina is facing itself. Because you know how the old saying goes, if you lend me a little bit of money, I owe you. If you lend me a lot of money, then it's your problem, not mine. And that's exactly the situation that the fund finds itself in, because it's $44 billion that have been dispersed to Argentina. It's money that the fund cannot do away with, and so it's going to have to find some way to engage with the Fernandez administration. If it is indeed the case that Fernandez follows the more pragmatic, moderate route, then inevitably he's going to have to continue, in some sense, the reform effort that Macri started. There's a bit of an issue here. I won't say much about it. I'll just put it out there as an issue, because of course, the whole campaign of Fernandez was about rejecting Macri's policies. So now, in order to re-engage with the IMF, he's going to have to forcibly embrace at least a portion of Macri's policies. So how he actually manages that politically and how he manages that with the electorate will, of course, require a lot of political maneuvering and a lot of communication, which we will see how that in the end is going to pan out. But for the fund at this point, what has happened in Argentina, not the elections, but what has happened with the program is obviously a failure. And it's a time of reckoning for the fund, in a sense, to see how it actually deals with this situation. Argentina needs the fund. Argentina has a big financing gap in 2020 that it needs to fill. It's not going to be able to fill that with money from investors, because everybody's shying away from Argentina at this point. So it really does need the IMF. One of the things that Fernandez does have going for him is the fact that the 2001 default is a trauma for Argentina and for the people of Argentina. And so the mere idea that non-engagement with the fund could potentially throw Argentina into a default is one of the political sort of cards that he has up his sleeve, which he can play. He can always say, we need to engage with the IMF because otherwise we will have a default. But it's still a politically difficult message to give.
Do you see the interest of both the IMF and the Fernandez administrations to be sort of like aligned in that regard that you were mentioning? And do you think that that might help negotiations or no?
Yeah, in some ways, yes, because as I said before, the fund now has a problem because it needs to get repaid. And Argentina has a problem because it can't repay the fund without the fund. So in a sense, we are kind of back to the same situation that Argentina used to be in, or Brazil for that matter, used to be in as well, which is, for the fund to get paid back and for the country to continue down its reform path and be financially viable, one needs the other. So the symbiotic relationship is there. And that is naturally going to lead them to the negotiating table. What kind of deal they're ultimately able to strike will depend a lot, I think, on the politics and what the fund is. Both sides are going to have to concede, I think, to some extent.
Okay, so you don't see the fund adopting a very harsh position, at least at the beginning?
They can't really afford to at this point, I think.
I hope you might like my second question better than the first one. That, since you're Brazilian, I wanted to ask you about the relationship between Fernandez and Bolsonaro.
Oh, I like that question.
Yes. All right, there we go. So, it looks like it's a very not bueno begin, for both of them. The messages have been like very feisty, and Fernandez has picked Mexico as his first destination. When traditionally it is Brazil. So what's up with that? I don't remember any other point in history when you have like two presidents who were not amicable with each other in Brazil and Argentina.
Yeah, I agree. So sadly, it looks like Brazil and Argentina, which have always had very good diplomatic relationships. So, even going back to the times before the dictatorship, during the dictatorship. Argentina democratized in 1983, so 2 years before Brazil did. But even in that transition period, the diplomatic relationship was always very, very good. I did make a joke, which I'll repeat. Sorry, students, I know you're here. But the one area where Brazil and Argentina do not have diplomatic relationships is, of course, soccer. And soon we're going to have the final of the Libertadores, for those of you who follow that. And it's between two teams, one from Brazil, the other one from Argentina. But that's something else, that's sports. In other areas, Brazil and Argentina have always had very good engagement. And of course, they're the two countries, the two largest countries within the Mercosur bloc. They are fairly isolated from the rest of the world because they're fairly closed economies, but they do have, between them, they have, because of Mercosur and because of the proximity, they have certain supply chains that run between them. So on autos, for example, you have a bit of a supply chain between Brazil and Argentina. On agricultural products, there's also a bit of a supply chain. So for private companies operating in these two countries, having a diplomatic spat between Argentina and Brazil is not good. It's not good for business. But Bolsonaro has, from the beginning, and especially after the primaries, he started upping the rhetoric on, the anti-Fernandez rhetoric, to which Fernandez responded. And so, for the moment, some of the things look like, kids playing in a playground because, the Lula sign, and then Bolsonaro saying, oh, I'm not going to call Fernandez, he won, but I'm not going to call him. It all sounds rather, dumb, to be frank. But it does have consequences, it does have consequences. And I think from here on out, it's likely that we will see a distancing of these two countries, which could even, given the Bolsonaro administration's stance on Mercosur and the things that they have said about Mercosur. So they have trashed Mercosur. They have said that this will sound familiar, it's a terrible deal. It's terrible. They have said that, and they have even mentioned, that Brazil would leave Mercosur. Some of that may be bluster. Some of that may not. And the relationship that develop between the two going forward are going to determine largely whether Mercosur is left standing or not.
Okay. I want to ask a question to the three of you, which is regarding Venezuela. Appears to be one of the big issues that's going to have to deal the future government of Alberto Fernandez, and also a very key issue for the bilateral relationship between Argentina and the U.S. I was hoping you could give us a perspective of what policy or what stance do you believe Alberto Fernandez could draw in the region? He's playing this balance between Grupo de Lima, Uruguay, and Mexico that could, sort of like leave him in a good position to form a relationship with the Trump administration. It seems like it's a very complicated triangle over there. Who wants to take that one?
I mean, I think this is actually, this is an area I think where genuinely Alberto Fernandez will take a moderate, pragmatic position, and even so, I think it'll cause a lot of tension with the Trump administration, which is not looking for moderation on Venezuela policy. And it has not received moderation from the Macri administration, which has been really all in on this Lima group effort for maximum pressure on Venezuela. And again, it's been very unusual for Latin America, right, which is a real non-intervention attitude. But on Venezuela, belatedly, but eventually, big countries in the region, particularly Colombia, Brazil, even Chile, and Argentina under Macri, have taken a very hard line on Venezuela, including referring the president of Venezuela to the International Criminal Court for human rights abuses. So if Argentina removes itself from the Lima group, denies recognition to Juan Guaido and his diplomats, and decides to ally itself with Mexico and Uruguay in what sounds like a pretty neutral and positive approach, which is supporting dialogue, I think that'll be a real source of tension with the White House.
Do you think that that could complicate the entire bilateral relationship, or is there any other areas that you could use to balance that out?
No. I mean, I think for two reasons. Number one, there's very little Latin America policy right now for the White House. There's basically a migration policy towards Central America, and there's Venezuela.
Well, there's
right?
China.
And there's the issue of China, which I think is also potentially problematic, where I think the way that Macri interacted with China, even if there's no change, will be seen as quite negative in the hands of a Peronist government. We can talk about that, but on Venezuela, frankly, it's the only issue. And then the second vector is Argentina is frankly just distant from the United States and doesn't have much to offer the United States beyond usefulness on Venezuela. I mean, the trade relationship is not that deep. So geostrategically, its value has been on Venezuela. And so when Argentina distances itself from the Lima Group and potentially destroys the Lima Group by leaving the Lima Group, I think there won't be much it can offer to compensate.
Adding to that, just one spin-off from what Benjamin said, you know, there is the Trump administration recently announced its commitment to back the accession to the OECD for Argentina and Romania in a sort of rebuff to Brazil. Yeah. And, you know, now that is, I think, up in the air, very much so.
Paula, do you think it's possible for Alberto Fernandez to adopt a more harsh stance towards Venezuela, given, you know, the internal situation in Argentina, where, you know, Maduro has some support within his coalition, and even Cristina Kirchner gave him the largest, the most important civilian condecoration, the Orden de San Martín?
Right. I think a lot depends on the Fernandez versus Fernandez kind of dynamics that we're going to see, because the Peronists historically have always been very pragmatic. The Cristina's core is the least pragmatic one. It's the more ideologically defined and focused one within the Peronist Party. But we look at the history of the Peronist Party. You know, Perón in the first administration nationalized everything. The second administration called, you know, privatized oil to come, and Standard Oil and the enemies and so forth. And so I think a lot of what Fernandez will be able to do will depend on how quickly he can get rid of the power of Cristina within the Peronist Party. And that, you know, so he's going to be really a president in a hurry, because he will need to construct that power for himself very, very quickly, and without margin of error. And so if only by doing that, he will be able to exercise fully control of his administration. Otherwise, if he doesn't manage to really diminish Cristina's power, and then he will just be a prisoner of that ideological sort of chain that Cristina can put into the Peronist Party. But the rest of the Peronists, besides that hardcore of the Cristinistas, they tend to be very pragmatic, and they like dialogue, and they can change directions and policies. But he will only be able to do that, again, if he can really diminish the power of Cristina within the Peronist Party, which it won't be easy. You know, in the Senate, Cristina is going to dominate most of the seats. In the lower house, things are quite balanced. I think it's 220 for the Peronists and 219 for Cambiemos. But again, I think what I was saying before, if Alberto decides to cross the aisle and get the support of Cambiemos for certain policies and so forth, to be able to be pragmatic and manage to diminish Cristina's power within the Peronist Party, then everything is possible. Because the Peronists are really adaptable, and that's why they have survived for so long. Because they adapt, they don't have internal structures. It's not going to depend on internal democracy, because they don't have one. So everything is going to be a battlefield between the two Fernandez, and which is going to be played out in many different territories. So if he's successful in diminishing her power and increasing therefore his, and if he's successful in the negotiations with the IMF and the US, then he can be as pragmatic as he probably wants to be. Yeah.
We should go to questions.
Yes, I have one more question before we open to the floor. Final one. 4 years ago, everything was hope and change for Argentina. Now there seems to be an atmosphere of concern in Washington. I want you, if you can just very succinct, what's your biggest concern when you think about the future of Argentina?
For me, that's
For the three of you.
for me. That Alberto does not succeed in choosing the right economic minister, the right policies, and then within the Parents' Party, we're going to have this big battle for power inside that bloc. I mean, that might not be very good.
Benjamin?
I think the biggest fear has already been realized, which is both for Argentina and the region, the idea of neoliberal reforms is once again a tainted concept. That Argentina, the reason I think the United States was so excited about Argentina was maybe there's a success and you can show that market liberalization works. And here again, for Argentina and for the region, it's the opposite. Right now, the message is don't listen to the IMF, don't liberalize, don't open your economy. All it brings is poverty and inequality. That's a problem.
Monica?
Yeah, for me, it's a bit of what both Benjamin and Paula said, and just adding on the regional perspective. You know, this is Argentina and Brazil. You know, to some extent, have always followed on each other's steps. You know, we've had in the past kind of similar governments following each other, and this is the first time where we have a complete divergence. And so, what kind of implication that has for, you know, two of the largest countries in the region, two of the largest economies, two of the largest democracies, I think can have consequences. I don't know exactly what they are, but can have consequences for the region as a whole. And that is what would keep me up at night.
All right. Thank you very much for your thoughts and remarks. We'll open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand, identify yourselves, and be very brief if possible over that.
Hi, Alex Sanchez, James Defense Weekly. Two questions. What is President Fernandez's internal security policy? President Macri deployed the Argentine armed forces to the north, to the borders of Bolivia, Paraguay, Brazil, to crack down drug trafficking. What has President Fernandez said about this? And secondly, out of pure curiosity, what do you think is President Macri's future? What is he going to do now that he's going to leave power? Will we see him in Washington as a consultant, work for the IMF or something like that? What is he going to do? Thank you.
All right, who wants to take that?
I'll take the second one. I think it will depend on court cases that he might have to answer to. What happens with the judiciary system, what happens with the politics. He already decided and claimed that he wants to be the leader of the opposition, but we'll have to wait and see if that will be possible. So that's what he wants. What he can do, I think, will depend on the Fernandez.
On security policy, I think that was like economic policy, something where the pendulum swang pretty dramatically. It swung between these administrations where it was seen as under Cristina's administration that there was a great interest in civil liberties and in the flowering of protest movements and activism to a fault. And as one of her liabilities going into the election in 2015 was insecurity, which at the time when the economy was not great was still polling very high as a concern of Argentines. Under the current government, it's been the opposite, right? There was a sense that the security minister was not respectful of civil liberties, was empowering police to act in ways that seemed abusive or insensitive to the rights of protest, which is pretty core to the political culture in Argentina. And again, there was even a discussion, which was surprising in the Argentine context, that the military might have a role once again in domestic security, in counter-narcotics, in managing the border with Bolivia. I would expect, we'll see again, it's the Fernandez versus Fernandez of how far it swings, but without a doubt, it will move much more in the direction of restraining the security services and keeping the military in the barracks and not having a major role, as it has not had since the dictatorship.
Yeah. All right, over there.
Thank you. Orlando Reos, a private consultant here in Washington. One of the elephants in the bazaar have not been mentioned is the presence of China in Latin America, and what kind of support, the possible support the Fernandez government could look for in China as a second source of last resort source for funding. And even more important than funding, I guess that investments and the presence of China in the in Vaca Muerta, which is the big oil and gas source. Is that something that in Washington or the US would consider a sort of a very difficult situation to handle? What that would bring to the relationship with Argentina? Thank you.
You have an I could answer the diplomatic piece and maybe the financing piece?
Fine.
Yeah. I think interestingly, I mean, I think China was non-ideological in its approach to Argentina. There was this election that brought, a center-right government, and I think China demonstrated something that it doesn't get a lot of credit for in Washington, particularly in this administration, which was sort of an ideological, indifference. And it continued the relationship, it even deepened the relationship. This credit line that the Central Bank of China offered Argentina was actually expanded under Macri. I think the diplomatic consequences, though, of, as I mentioned, even the status quo might be significant, which is to say, I think things that Macri got away with, Alberto Fernandez might not. And so in the way the Trump administration has handled China and Latin America, there have been moments where, non-recognition of Taiwan all of a sudden has brought the United States to pull its charges and ambassadors from, Central America and the Caribbean. You could see visits to Beijing by Alberto Fernandez being seen very differently than a similar visit by Macri, being seen as political rather than economic. Again, even if there's no additional engagement, and actually there probably will be. There may be the Belt and Road Agreement may be formally signed between China and Argentina. So there may even be actual political alignment that you didn't see under Macri. But again, even if there's not, even if it's mostly an economic relationship, it still could generate tensions in a double standard because, again, President Trump felt close personally to President Macri. He will not feel that way about Alberto Fernandez.
Yeah, I completely agree with Benjamin on all fronts. I would add that, for Argentina, certainly if there's a standoff, let's say with the IMF, and if the financing shortfall, which is very real, becomes binding, a very clear binding constraint, it is a possibility that Argentina would turn to China, and China would probably be eager to help, because they have been eager to help other countries in the region, given their interest in, being more present. And that, of course, would add to all of the things that Benjamin has just mentioned. So watching China and what China does and how this relationship between Argentina and China develops going forward is going to be extremely interesting, including because it will have repercussions for the rest of the region, and it will affect other countries in the region as well and how they react to China, given the polarization between the US on the one hand and China on the other.
All right, over here.
Thank you. Eduardo Calderon, a student here at SAIS. I have a question regarding a little bit of the relationship between Argentina and the IMF, but more considering the fact that this was the program was negotiated with Macri and all the relationship that Macri had with the IMF, but now not only Macri is not there, but Ms. Lagarde is not there. Could that be a difference now that Ms. Georgieva is taking over, or is that's not really a problem and everything should follow the path that it should follow?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So there were significant changes to Macri's economic team over time. Right? So people who were, previously there early on when the program was negotiated left. Some of those were exactly the people who were former IMF staffers. So the fund was already negotiating with different people along the way. And during the campaign and during, this period that we've seen play out this year, the fund hasn't dispersed the next round of the program, but it has remained engaged with Argentina. It has gone on so-called staff visits to Argentina. It has been talking to people from Fernandez's camp. The director of the Western Hemisphere department at the fund has also done the same. He's talked to Fernandez himself. So the fund already knows more or less the people that they are possibly going to be negotiating with and speaking with. So I think on that front, I don't see much of a problem. The bigger problem is what is the agenda going to be, and what are the priorities going to be, and how is Fernandez going to organize those priorities. As for Ms. Lagarde's leaving, her successor is excellent. She was formerly at the World Bank, as you know. She is very technical. In a sense, she's much more technical than Ms. Lagarde. So I expect that to have an influence. Nonetheless, I think she's very well aware of the sensitivities between the fund and Argentina. So some change, but not huge change.
All right.
Thank you. So my question is specifically, any panelist who wants to answer this is welcome to, but my question is actually for Professor Alonso. I read this week in America's Quarterly that the Peronist Coalition did a much more effective job of reaching out to young voters, portraying themselves as the party of young voters and the party of reproductive rights, more so than Juntos por el Cambio. So are there positive steps that the Cambiemos Coalition can take to improve their appeal for the next election, or are they really just stuck waiting for the Peronists to make a mistake?
Thank you for the question. I think looking back, besides the economic mistakes that they did during these 4 years, many of them, are very well known, and the administration is very aware of them. I think a lot they need to learn about how to do politics. and of course, what happened with the PASO was an example of that they took them by surprise. They thought it was not going to be relevant. And of course, they unraveled a huge different path until last Sunday. And the same with the youth. I think they have to do a better job there, much better. They don't have, the Cambiemos doesn't have, and what it still needs to have, besides being the non-Peronist bloc, they need to have an identity of their own, which still they haven't developed that much. It can't be just Cambiemos. It's just a silly name for a silly slogan. And so they have to probably work now as an opposition that is actually a much more relaxing kind of exercise than to be in power. They probably should use that time to consolidate their image, think about their politics, think about how to attract different groups, and how, because really, they did really learn a lot in the last 2 months, and they showed that in the last election, but it was too late, too little, too late. And so hopefully they will learn to do politics. Let's remember that Cambiemos is relatively new, so let's give them that sort of consolation prize. And the Peronists have been doing this for decades. Look at Alberto Fernandez and the experience he comes to government with. And look at Macri, who, he had been in the city of Buenos Aires, but he didn't have the experience that somebody like the Peronists had. So they have a lot to learn. The good news for them is that the 40% plus is giving them room to learn. If they had had the same result as in the PASO, we probably were going to be looking at a very different scenario for the future. So there's room there for them. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Paula, Benjamin, Monica, thank you very much for the invitation. It's been my honor to join you in this panel. Please join me in a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.